All right, so welcome back, everybody. We had last week kind of sort of an off week from lectures. We had the exam on Tuesday, and then Thursday was a national day for truth and reconciliation. But today we're going back to our Poetic Edda, and we are transitioning to the heroic poems, moving away from these strictly mythological poems. And to get us started with this, I'm very happy to welcome Dr. Jackson Crawford, who is an American scholar and poet who specializes in Old Norse. He's previously taught at University of Colorado Boulder, UC Berkeley, and UCLA. He has his PhD from University of Wisconsin-Madison in Scandinavian Studies, and we were grad students together. So Jackson and I go back a ways, and he's really well known for the excellent public scholarship that he does and his YouTube channel. And one of my favorite things, favorite Jackson facts, is that he translated Star Wars into Old Norse, right? And
it is true.
It is true. You were also told by Lucasfilms to not to say something with Lucasfilms, and also he was a consultant with actually two people who are coming to class this term have consulted with Disney for Frozen. One for Frozen, the first Frozen movie, which was Jackson, and then we'll have Tom Dubois, who was with Frozen 2. But I'll stop talking and I'll turn it over to Jackson, who will get us started with the Helgi poems. And Jackson has, of course, done a translation of the Poetic Edda, as well as a translation of a number of other works, including the saga Ragnar Lothbrok. And he has done some unique translations of the sayings of the High One as well. But I will mute myself and spotlight you. Do you have anything you need to share?
Do I?
Yeah, like I mean PowerPoint share, not like personal.
Oh, no. Well, I probably ought to clarify 2 points you made there. Actually, Tom Dubois and I both were involved in both Frozen movies.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, we're both credited in both, even though there's nothing you can see from me in the second one. And the other thing is, yes, I received an angry letter from Lucasfilm, which I have somewhere. I've moved so many times since then that I'm not really sure where it is, but I framed it because it was really nice. It's the nicest threatening letter I've ever received. Hello, everyone. Thank you for that very kind introduction from Professor Van Deusen, with whom I do indeed go back a ways. She told me that y'all were part of a Canada-wide sleep study this late morning, and so she brought me in to induce the sleep so that the sleep scientists can study all. So let's talk a little bit about heroic poetry, and kind of situated somewhere between the narrative poems of the gods and then the heroic sagas, because it has points in common with both, but then there are also some unique factors to consider. So one thing that I think is really fascinating about many of these heroic poems, a couple that I'll name in particular are Atlakvida and the Poetic Edda, about the death of Attila or Atli, Hamdismal, the last poem in the Poetic Edda, as it's usually ordered, which is about the death of Gudrun's sons Hamdir and Sorli, and then the battle or the war of the Goths and the Huns, which is preserved in the saga of Airborne Heydrich, which I also just translated. To throw that onto that pile. These poems are actually quite old. If you look at the language in them, it is pretty archaic for Old Norse, right? In fact, these 3 poems that I just named might be the oldest non-skaldic poetry that we know of in the Old Norse language. People will disagree about that, but and of course, you've probably looked a little bit at how poetry might be dated. If not, I'm happy to talk a little bit about that too. But in short, language changes in every generation, certainly every century. And so poetry that works in one generation or century might not work in another, right? So Shakespeare, even though you can reprint him in 2021, no one rhymes love and prove like Shakespeare did. So that's a pretty good hint that even if it's reprinted in 2021, it wasn't composed in 2021. This kind of thing. points to a lot of these poems being quite old, even in an Old Norse context. But then there's interesting questions like, well, what does old mean? Does it mean that, you know, the entire composition and the entire story as it's passed down to us is therefore old? And in fact, it really doesn't, right? These can be jumbles of old and new, or from our perspective, different layers of old. So for example, you know, I mentioned how Shakespeare can be reprinted in 2021. Well, entire quotes can be, you know, copied into much newer compositions in, say, 2021, right? I could take some stanza from Shakespeare, work it into a poem that I compose now, and then is my poem old? Not exactly, but it is old pieces. And we may in fact be dealing with some of that in these poems. Or if you look at something like the phrase "till death do us part," many people repeat this now, right? And it might show up in many different movies and wedding scenes and things like that. But the language is transparently very archaic, right? If we were to say that in natural 2021 language, "till death do us part" would be "until death parts us." So just because that old phrase is embedded in a movie in 2021 doesn't mean the 2021 movie has a story that's as old as the phrase "till death do us part." I hope that makes some sense. So we can see some genuinely old elements, but we have to try to be careful if we're doing responsible scholarship about these poems and restrict ourselves to say, well, you know, this stanza probably is quite old in origin, based on the fact that the alliteration wouldn't work in the 1200s when the saga it's embedded in was written, but would work quite well in, say, 900s AD Old Norse. It doesn't mean that the saga in which it's embedded tells a story that's equivalently as old as the poem that's embedded in it. You can actually see this a little bit with the poems about the gods. So let's see, Professor Van Deusen is a little small in my view right now, but can I ask, y'all looked at lokasena probably, right? Or
yes, we talked about Loki's quarrel. Yeah.
Yeah. So in lokasena, we have a poem that has, based on some of the poetic language, we could assume that it's pretty old. People disagree about it, but I think you could probably date it to the late 900s, most of the poetry in it. But the frame, the prose that begins and ends that poem as it's preserved in the Poetic Edda is much younger. And it's interesting that in that prose, we read that, you know, Loki has just killed a servant, and then he's kicked out of the feast, and then he comes back to the feast, and that's when he starts insulting the gods. But without that prose, if we just started at Loki shows up at a feast of the gods and starts insulting everybody, the context still works. So it might not be that this poem was handed down with a story about Loki killing a servant and then getting kicked out. The poem might just be passed down as him insulting the gods, and that frame is inserted later. Just like the part at the end, the prose epilogue that says that, you know, the gods tracked him down and he hid in the form of a salmon and they caught him and they imprisoned him under the earth, the poison dripping on his face. That might not originally have been tied in with this poem either. So we have to be kind of careful that we're not confusing these old kernels that can get embedded in later material, that we're not confusing the age of different layers. Of course, it's a tall order. It's easy to do because it's all old to us, and those lines are not necessarily always very clear. It's also interesting, I think, to note that these stories about great heroes in poems, using usually the same meter as the poems about the narrative poems about the gods. For near this log is the meter that's typically used. Same meter as in like Voluspa, the prophecy of the Volva, or Termskvida, where Thor's hammer gets stolen. So the stories are told in poetry and this older layer, but then we see in the 1200s, 1300s, many of these poems either getting worked into or reworked as sagas. So the last half of the Poetic Edda more or less gets reworked into the saga of the Volsungs. And then poems like the Battle of the War of the Goths, the Huns, or the Waking of Angantyr get worked into a prose frame in the saga of Hervor and Haetheric. So, you know, for 2021 readers or audiences, telling long stories in poetry is a little bit unusual. right? It's probably not going to get you on the New York Times bestseller list. And I think probably the last narrative poet who got on the New York Times bestseller list was Robinson Jeffers 100 years ago. And no one's heard of him now. So we find it odd to tell these long stories in poetry, but it seems like maybe in the 1200s and 1300s, they were already also finding it weird to tell these stories in poetry. And we have to be a little bit wary about the editorial decisions made by those saga writers in the 1200s, 1300s. They often, sometimes their tastes seem a little bit closer to ours than maybe they were to the taste of the people originally composing these poems. They want a more coherent, longer, successional story. Whereas many of these poems, as you go through them, you'll notice that even when they relate to the same characters, they're often disjuncted. You know, they're composed by a different person at a different time. They tell a story slightly differently, or they assume that something slightly different has happened, right? So, for example, in the poems Gudrun and Kvidha 2 and 3, the second and third poem of Gudrun and the Poetic Edda, Gudrun's brothers Gunnar and Hogni have been killed, spoiler alert, and she hasn't avenged their deaths on her husband Atli. But they're right next to, in the manuscript, the Codex Regius, and in most translations of Poetic Edda, they're right next to a poem, Atli Kvidha, where her husband Atli kills them and she avenges them immediately. So there's no chance for all the events of the poem of Gudrun 2 and 3. So in many ways, the continuity between these poems is more like the continuity between comic books than it is between different chapters in a novel or different episodes in a TV series today, where we expect what came before to inform what comes next and for them not to just blatantly contradict one another. But with comic books, which I think are a better parallel, we often have really stable sets of characters, right? Everybody knows roughly who Wolverine is supposed to be or who Superman is supposed to be, but we don't necessarily expect that an issue of Superman that we pick up in 2021 is a direct sequel to a issue of Superman you can pick up from 1975, right? And I think that's a better way to look at these poems, is the character set is pretty consistent. People have kind of an expectation of the kind of thing that Sigurður does, the kind of thing Atli does, maybe for some really central major actions taken by one character or another. Sigurdur's a dragon slayer. Atli throws Gunnar into a snake pit. These things are consistent, but then other sort of satellite events around them are not so consistent. And it doesn't seem to have bothered, either didn't bother the original audience of these as poems, or you know, we're just seeing sort of fragments of several different traditions that traveled down a river roughly in parallel with one another. But those 1200s, 1300s writers of the sagas, a little bit more like us, and probably influenced by classical literature models, by ecclesiastical literature models, want more coherence. They want more of an arrow of time through a story, and so they turn them into probably more coherent stories than they were ever passed down as orally. I don't think that's too controversial of a statement. What would you say, Professor Van Deusen?
I like the comic book analogy. I really like that a lot.
Well, if you like that one, I'm going to run this into a ground with another analogy. Here's another one, James Bond, right? James Bond is a consistent sort of character, right? No matter which movie he's in, but then he looks different because he's played by like 7 different guys, right? And there's not really, except I guess between a few of them, continuity between the stories, right? We have an expectation of who James Bond is, right? He drives nice cars. He usually has a Walther PPK. He's a British secret agent. He's going to drink a martini or something, but it's not like, you know, you're going to miss something in Goldfinger if you didn't see Dr. No, right? And I think it's a similar vibe. So this is another, I think, interesting aspect to these poems being old, is that in me saying that they're old, I'm not saying that they're ever canonized, right? It seems like there was a fair amount of toleration for variation in these stories, at least in these early centuries before they're committed to writing by the saga writers and whoever compiled the Poetic Edda. So maybe what's happening over time is that phrases, stanzas, maybe entire poems kind of get fossilized at a certain point, to get sort of established at some place in time, and then passed down in a somewhat consistent form from that point forward. But then you have stories that get passed down in several different forms, and it can be really, really hard to tell what the original was, if indeed any of the forms that are preserved are closer to the quote original than any others. And the Helgi poems are a great example of that. So you notice in each version of the Helgi story, and really the three poems, Helgi the Hjorvatsonar, Helgi the Hundingsbana 1, Helgi the Hundingsbana 2, are versions of one story. In each one, you have a lot of the same core events, and to some extent, core character and core character set, but with a lot of differences on the margins. All right, so we have our hero Helgi, who's going to fall in love with a Valkyrie, but is the Valkyrie's name Swalva, or is it Sigrun? Do they get married or don't they get married before he dies? Spoiler alert. There's always an insult fight in Helgi the Hjorvatsonar. It's an insult fight between Helgi's kind of sidekick Atli and a Jotun or giant or troll woman named Hrimgerður. And then in Helgi the Hundingsbana 1 and 2, it's an insult fight between his brother cousin, Sinfjotli, and Gudmundur. And then, but in the first Helgi Slayer of Hunding poem, it's a long drawn out insult battle. And in the second one, it's a quite abbreviated thing that Helgi cuts off pretty fast. Which of these is oldest, right? If any of them are. It's notable that in the version in Helgi, son of Hjorvarth, where it's Atli exchanging insults with the troll woman Hrimgerður, that the meter changes. So we go from narrative poetry that's in the same meter as like the Sirius prophecy or Thrymskvida, the meter 4 near the Sog, to the Ljóðaháttr meter, which is the same meter as in, say, Hálfmál or lokasena, a meter for monologues or dialogues. Now, since the meter changes, that might mean that that insult battle is from some context that originally was preserved separately from the narrative frame that it's embedded in, already in poetry. But it might not. Maybe the meter changes just because it's felt to be more appropriate to this sort of context. It is, after all, the same meter used in a similar context in the poem Lokasena, where Loki insults the gods. And then we notice that in the poem about Helgi, son of Hjorvarth, he is, well, son of Hjorvarth. But then in the other two, the Helgi Slayer of Hunding poems, he is the son of Sigmundur, the Volsung hero. Now, I would suspect, and different people will disagree about this, I would suspect that the older state of affairs is that Helgi is son of a hero named Hjorvarth, disconnected from the Volsung story. But the Volsungs act as a kind of a magnet for other mythical heroes. I'm gonna hit you with another analogy that you'll hate, but it will help with the sleep project. If civilization were to end today and only a few hundred people in a small community in, for y'all's sake, I'll say Alberta, were to survive, a few hundred years from now, their descendants might have all of these stories passed down about the heroes that original surviving generation told stories about once there was no more TV and internet. And those stories might have been originally about several different families of heroes, right? The Harry Potter universe of stories, the Star Wars universe of stories, the Star Trek universe of stories, the Lord of the Rings universe of stories. But over time, one of those narratives starts absorbing the others, right? So that, say it's a Star Wars universe that kind of acts as the magnet, you wind up with the Harry Potter stories when they're related slowly getting more and more integrated into that universe of stories, so that eventually, Harry Potter is Harry Skywalker, who goes to Jedi school, and there he finds out from his teacher Gandalf, who's a great Jedi who talks backwards, that he's got to go destroy the ring. Now I'm sounding like that meme where you have Jean-Luc Picard saying, "Use the Force, Harry," right? Anyway, the Volsungs are that. They absorb over time all these other stories. And you can actually see it pretty transparently in some of these old poems if you compare them to the saga of the Volsungs. And Professor Van Deusen will have to enlighten me as to how much of any of that you've read. Transparently in some of these old poems if you compare them to the saga of the Volsungs. And Professor Van Deusen will have to enlighten me as to how much of any of that you've read. Saga of the Volsungs and the Volsungs.
The Saga of the Volsungs is going to be coming up next. We're reading the poems first, and then we're reading the Saga of the Volsungs.
Cool. This is a perfect time for me to mention this then, actually. So you'll notice these poems about the Volsungs are, as I said, disjuncted. It's a little bit more like a comic book continuity. You're not going to get one cohesive story out of them. And the Saga of the Volsungs, you get a kind of cohesive story out of them, although actually even the saga author can't quite decide about some things. Like he has Sigurd and Brynhild meet twice, which probably comes from two different traditions of him meeting Valkyries. But what was I saying? The very last poem about the Volsungs, it's in the Poetic Edda, Hum the Small. You have, actually I'll type this in the chat since I'm looking at the chat. You have the sons of Gudrun, Hamdir and Sorli, go avenge their sister Svanhildr, who has been killed by a king named Jormunrek. And they're assisted by their mother Gudrun, who suddenly has magical powers that she's never had before in the story. Now, it's interesting to note that a Gothic historian named Jordanes in the 500s talks about people with almost the same names doing almost the same things, but it has nothing to do with the Volsungs, right? It's a disconnected story about some intrigue between different Gothic tribes. So he talks about these two brothers, and he gives them Latinized names that look a lot like Hamdir and Sorli, who go and avenge their sister, who has a Latinized name, a lot like Svanhildr, on a king named Latinized version of Jormunrek, and they're assisted by a witch named Latinized version of Gudrun. Now, Gudrun doesn't look like their mom in this story, but slowly, it looks like what's happened is by the time this poem is composed in Old Norse, and it's a very archaic poem, this could be from the late 800s, so a few hundred years after the events in Southeast Europe, it's been drawn into the Volsung's orbit. Gudrun, the witch, has become Gudrun, who was the wife of Sigurd, even though that's probably not really who this character originally was. It seems like a story that originally had nothing to do with the Volsung's orbit. It's just been drawn in, right? Like a comet passing through its heavy gravitational field. So as you read through the poems in the Volsung tradition of the Poetic Edda, and then read the saga of the Volsungs, note where the seams could be. I mean, practically each chapter could represent kind of a seam, but I think there's some big ones. I think that, for example, the story of the dragon slaying is originally not connected to a lot of the other elements that it's embedded in of the Volsung's myth. And Beowulf, which was written down many hundreds of years before any of the Norse materials were, it's actually not Sigurdur, but his father Sigmundur and his son nephew, again with the incest, Sinfjotli, who killed the dragon. And there's no mention of, of Valkyrie or Gudrun and Gunnar and Hogni, right? It seems like that dragon slaying story is originally its own separate story that's again been drawn into this big nexus point of Sigurdur. But I've talked here for almost a half hour. Give me any questions, remarks, criticisms, complaints, manifestos that you may have those of you who I haven't successfully put into the coma state that the university requested me to.
I'm liking the analogies. Yes, me too.
I try.
I think that's really helpful.
Curse.
That's really, so is that why name spellings change? Hannah asks.
The analogies thing is a curse. I can only talk in analogies. So name spellings are like breakfast. Well, name spellings can change for a lot of different reasons. So I have to kind of know what different name spellings you're thinking of. Sometimes just different translators will anglicize names different ways, right? So for example, I'll show you. Okay, I see what you're saying. So this may be an example of what you're talking about. I think this is more about actual anglicization. So the name of the hero who slays the dragon in Old Norse is, I'm going to type it here, Sigurður. S-I-G-U-R-R. Now, of course, that second to last letter there, ed, represents the TH sound in English words like worthy, breathe, clothes. But since it's actually a variation of a curved medieval D, it's just a D with a slash through it, many translators or editors or transliterators are going to turn it into a D, whereas when I translated the Poetic Edda, not when I translated later books, when I translated the first book in my series, I used TH to represent something closer to what it sounds like to an English speaker. So you might see Sigurd with TH, you might see Sigurd with D. You might see something I experimented with, which is turning it into a straight backed letter D to show that it's graphically different, but not a D, this thing. Many translators pull the R off because it's just a case ending, just a grammatical marker in Old Norse, but some might not. So you might see the very same name written, and I'll just give you a couple examples of different variations of this. And those are all coming from the same name, which is written the first way in Old Norse. So part of it is just that we don't have a consistent way that everyone agrees on and anglicizing Old Norse. I think that's most of what it is. Okay, hold on. I see other questions here. Liam Click says, slightly off topic question related to my own research interest. Surely there'll be time for that. Let's come back to that toward the end, maybe. Colby McKenzie asks, would someone like Snorri understand the dating difference? Like, would he see the seams? That's a great question. I think that quite potentially someone like Snorri could. Snorri, it does pay a lot of attention to his source material, but I don't know if he would call it out when he saw it. And I think that's a different thing. If you look at the prose Edda, I think there's several places where Snorri, maybe even if he does see the difference or the seams between different scenes and elements, doesn't present them that way. So for example, in different poems in the Poetic Edda, and surely in poems that are lost, we read that there is a bird of prey that sits at the top of the poultry Yggdrasil. And you only ever read about one in poetry that I can think of. But Snorri says there's two. Snorri says there's an eagle and a hawk sits on its face. Now, my suspicion is that the reason he says that is that there are poems where he heard that it was an eagle, because probably the poet was alliterating with vowels, and Old Norse equals orn. And then he heard poems where it was a hawk. So the poet had just used the word hawk because it alliterated H with another H with another H. And Snorri isn't able to accept that it's just a bird of prey and poets are just using a word that alliterates with what they needed to alliterate with. He's got to kind of have it both ways. And so he makes it equal with a hawk in its face. I think this is maybe in general a semi-praiseworthy impulse on the part of Snorri. If I can judge someone from 800 years ago, he does want to include everything that he knows, but I think that sometimes it does mean that he jumbles things, even if he does probably himself understands that they don't go together. I hope that kind of answers that, at least my perspective on it. Cody says Tolkien has a rendition of Sigurd that was published a few years ago by the Tolkien estate. Works like this have any value in our scholarly scope? I assume you probably mean the legend of Gudrun and Sigurd, where he, I think what that is he took the big lacuna, the big gap in the Volsung's poems in the Poetic Edda, and he tried to fill it in with his own original poetry. I mean, I guess I can politician this to you a little bit. What is value? Personally, I'm interested in what's there in the original medieval sources. I don't take issue with someone trying to fill in a gap like that, but I also don't think that J.R.R. Tolkien was a special psychic who necessarily knew exactly what went there. It can maybe serve as an illustrative example of what might have gone into that gap, but I suppose my short answer is I don't think J.R.R. Tolkien had any special insight into filling in what that gap was. I see Liam Click ask, could you explain the case marker art? Yeah, so real quick, the many names in Old Norse, most masculine names, some feminine names, end in an R when they are the subject of a sentence. So Sigurður meant me, but I met Sigurd. So if you know another case-based language like Latin, it's the nominative ending. It's equivalent to the S and the nominative in Latin. Since it's not part of the root of the name, translators typically remove it. Probably part of why they remove it is that it creates, somewhat awkward-looking words. Like, here's some names that look difficult for people to read. It just removes one less obstacle. But it's become so normal with translators that I don't know any mainstream non-academic translators, like not doing it for an academic audience, who don't remove the R. And Eilish asks, what's your favorite god or goddess in Old Norse mythology? I would probably say Odin. I just enjoy Havamal a lot, and I think that it offers a lot of interesting lessons and mysteries. So I will go with Odin for that reason, also because I like ravens and other birds. All right. Peyton, what do you think of the Freya Frigg debacle? I assume you mean the difference between Freya and Frigg. I think there is I think there's good potential that there were people in early centuries who thought of Freya and Frigg as the same goddess, and people who thought that they weren't. Right? If you read Lokasena, Freya and Frigg are definitely distinct characters, but then you see a lot of confusion between them elsewhere. So, for instance, does the bird cloak, the falcon suit that Loki puts on to fly, does that belong to Freya or to Frigg? It seems to vary. The husband of Freya is said to be Other, which is just another form of the exact same name as Odin. And since Odin has 80 other names, I've always assumed that it's Odin. I don't think that this is actually maybe a pretty good example of what I'm talking about in terms of sort of the comic book continuity here. I don't think there's actually necessarily one single canonical answer that you can make for pre-Christian Norse mythology. There may be places where these two beings are more conflated and places where they're less conflated. And I don't know which one might necessarily be the older situation, if it's more like two conflated later or more like one that's been split later. I don't have a good basis for making that call without making some really long linguistic arguments, maybe. Oh, okay. So in the, I see a question here from Hugh, who asks about the meter change in the first Helgi poem. So first of all, I ought to clarify what I mean when I say first Helgi poem. In the manuscript, the order of these poems is a little bit confusing because you start with Helgi Slayer Funding 1, then you go to Helgi's Hjorvard's Son, then you go to Helgi Slayer Funding 2. in my translation, I actually took the liberty of shifting this so that Helgi, son of Hjorvar, is first, because it's more different from the other two than the other two are from each other. So when I say the first, I ought to clarify, I mean Helgi, son of Hjorvar. So in that poem, most of the narrative, as in the large portion of narrative poems about gods and heroes, is in the meter Fornøyðarslag. And depending on the translation that you read, this is the kind of the bulk of the meter in the Poetic Edda, and it's going to be stanzas that are either 8 lines or 4 lines for the most part. Again, depending on translators, because different translators consider it 4 lines or 8 lines, but it'll be 4 or 8. But when Atli starts to have his insult battle with Hrimgerður, all of a sudden the meter is in this style, Ljóðaháttr, which, again, depending on the translator, is going to be, 1, 2, 3, I guess, 4 or 6 lines. But it's notably different in Old Norse because what you have is a 3rd and a 6th line that alliterate with themselves and not with other lines. So it's pretty noticeable if you're an attentive reader of Old Norse when it shifts. And that Ljóðaháttr meter is used more for, well, it's the meter of Hávamál. It's the meter of almost all Hávamál, or so the meter of wisdom, but it's also a lot of times the meter of dialogue. So it's the meter of lokasena, where the gods are insulting one another. That may not mean that those parts are older. In fact, it could mean those parts are newer, right, and are folded into an older narrative in Fornøyðarslag. But I think that it's an interesting reminder that even at the layer where these are being transmitted as poetry, probably at the oral transmission level, you're already getting pieces that probably didn't originally belong together getting put together. Or the poet is making a decision that this would be the proper meter for this exchange. Although I don't think that other dialogue in that particular poem is in that meter. So it's probably, at any rate, originally not part of the same exact composition as the narrative that's around it. I hope that's a fair answer. And of course, Professor Van Deusen may rebut any or all of my points here.
No, I will not.
Okay,
I'm in
all right.
agreement.
Thank you. All right. Elizabeth asks, there seems to be both dialogue and monologue in the Helgi set. Is there an age differentiation between monologue and dialogue? Remind me where you see monologue. I'm trying to think of where there's someone just talking without an audience. Monologue is generally, I would say, a little unusual in Norse poetry, except in what they call gnomic contexts, like a Hávamál, where it's wisdom being shared and there's not necessarily an explicit audience. If you can point me to where it's just monologue, just someone talking without a conversant, I would be interested in what you mean. I guess when Helgi, for instance, in Helgi, son of Hjorvar, when he first starts talking, the Valkyrie kind of monologues at him. Okay. Yeah, so in terms of age differences between different parts of these poems, I don't feel like I can offer a very conclusive answer about which, if any, of the Helgi poems or parts of the Helgi poems are older. I look for this stuff, right? I get interested in trying to make a guess about how old poems are. And unfortunately with the Helgi poems, I'm a little bit out to sea. I don't recall seeing anything that made me say, oh yeah, that gives it away. That's an alliteration that wouldn't work in 1200, or anything that gives it away and says, oh, this wouldn't work in the 900s, so it's clearly much later. There's not a lot in those poems that makes me confident to go in one way or the other. Surely people disagree, but I'm not sure I could make that call. And that's, of course, particularly interesting when you have Helgi, son of Hjorbarth, having two different meters. One doesn't look older to me than the other, but someone else might disagree. But of course, in the same way, surely if we had a fine ear that we could probably only really get as native speakers, we might be able to hear differences between, sort of poetic voices, the same way that, you can pick up Walt Whitman and Robert Frost and tell, whose poem is whose, just from kind of a voice. But that stuff is notoriously hard to get a feel for in a language you don't have native competence in, no matter how competent you are, where there aren't really native speakers to ask. Right, modern Icelanders certainly speak a similar language, but not the exact same language. And these poems are archaic from their perspective, all of them. Other questions, remarks, criticisms, complaints, manifestos, or off-topic questions, since I was threatened with one of those.
Would it be easier for me to put that in chat or ask it aloud?
Oh, it doesn't matter.
Okay. So my question is actually kind of going back to the from Skiva, because my research interest is related to queer associations with Thor, because I know it's some real research with Odin. So I'm curious to look at it from Skiva in the same way. So my question is, given Thor's cross-dressing and from Skiva is an inversion of gender roles, would that also mean that there's an inversion of sexual roles as well, as the hammer placed on Thor's lap has the phallic symbolism?
That is certainly a different direction. So in the poem Thrymskvida, of course, Thor dresses up as a bride. He does not seem to shape change like Loki does. And then at the end, when he's sort of almost married to Thrymr, and the hammer is touched to his knees, many people have seen that as a phallic symbol. I personally don't know if it necessarily needs to be read that way, and I'm not a literary critic. I will say that when knees and thighs come up in sagas, it sometimes does seem to be a kind of euphemism for a more private part of the body. So potentially that's also to be understood here. Maybe the hammer is touching something more private than the knee, in fact. But I was going to say, maybe Professor Van Deusen has seen something that I haven't, but I have seen so many 20th and 21st century books. I don't know about peer-reviewed articles, but books, the classic surveys like Turbo Peter and that kind of thing, that say that in early modern Sweden, there was some kind of bridal ritual where a hammer was touched to a bride's knees. And that sounds so interesting. It's so similar to this, but I've never actually found the documentation for that. Have you ever seen where they get that? Because I've never seen.
No, I haven't, but admittedly, I've not looked too closely for it either. So
yeah, but it always seems like it's something these 20th century, 21st century sort of compilers say, and then I can never track it down.
No, and it certainly hasn't come up in any more recent studies about gender and what that talks specifically about like marriage and how marriage rituals went. But,
yeah, I think it might have just been a little bit of 19th century, 20th century hearsay, but maybe not. Maybe that would be something to track down in doing research on that subject. Let's see, Colby asks, oh, this is also getting far afield. This is digging into my own shames, but which Star Wars movie did you translate? So 2010, long ago, when we were both at the University of Wisconsin, I was going up for my quals, my PhD quals, right? You finish your classwork, you take a bunch of tests, and then you start working on your dissertation. So I was coming up on those, and I thought, well, I'm supposed to be the master of Old Norse language, whatever, right? So I read Old Norse all the time. Maybe what I need to do is write Old Norse. So I was kind of casting around for something to write in Old Norse. And at the same time, there was this thing back then, your parents might have told you about, called Facebook. And it was kind of like the social media websites of today. And it had this thing where it asked you for your status. And the status was third person, right? So it would start with, Jackson Crawford is or says or whatever. And I never really understood what it was for. So I would usually just put movie quotes in it. And at one point I recall I put in as my status on this Facebook thing, Jackson Crawford is no moon, he's a space station. And right, just some Star Wars quote. And a good friend of mine, also at the University of Wisconsin and the grad student in the German department at the time, Ben Fry, said, Star Wars has always struck me as being a lot like an Icelandic saga. And somehow that just ignited it for me. And I thought, yeah, it kind of is. So fast forward a couple of years, and I had translated all the Star Wars movies that existed at the time, so the original series and the prequel trilogy, into Old Norse. However, I also back translate them into English so they can be read in English, and they're actually translated into an Icelandic saga, so that, for example, it doesn't take place in outer space. It takes place in the North Atlantic in the 900s, and Palpatine's the Emperor of Norway. And, there's some plot changes. Vader kills Luke instead of the other way around, for example. That way I can quote Hildebrand's lead. It was just an absurd thing that I did for, who knows why I persisted in it. But yeah, it's out there. I see that your professor has quickly tracked down the link, as if that was just in your bookmarks somewhere.
I had your Wikipedia page up. It's in there.
Oh yeah, that's right. The Wikipedia page. That's a thing that happens to one.
It's not happened to me, but that's I think you're at a different level than I am, Jackson. That's with your
I don't know.
fame.
Yeah, quote unquote fame. Famous in the smallest possible way, as a friend of mine said. I gotta say the Wikipedia article is not that accurate, but it's more accurate than some published things. So, it gets things wrong, gets things right. Anyway, I was trying to think if I could segue from that into heroic poetry, and I'm struggling. Here's my segue. So I mentioned that in Star Wars is an Icelandic saga, Tatooine or Dula saga, saga of the people of the Tatooine River Valley. Vader kills Luke. So part of why I wanted to work that in was I was always really struck by the only real remnant of heroic poetry in Old High German. There's my segue, see, which is Hildebrand's Lied. And it's actually just one page of a father and son who don't know one another and find themselves on opposite sides of an army. The dad, in opposite armies, the dad kills the son, then finds out he was the son. Anyway, it's a lot of pathos. It's actually pretty similar to an old Slavic story too, but it's only preserved because it was used as the binding for another book, this page of the manuscript. And it's interesting that you look at it, and the poetic style is basically Norse for near the Slavic, just like Beowulf is in Old English, just like Heliond, the Old Saxon Gospels from Northern Germany are. So this is clearly a tradition that goes way, way back to the common linguistic, cultural, literary heritage of people speaking Old Germanic languages, right? Because we find essentially the same style down to a lot of the same particular alliterating phrases in Old Norse, Old English, Old Saxon, by which I mean Old Low German, Old High German, and probably it was there in Gothic too, if we had anything in Gothic that was really Gothic, not a translation of the Bible or biblical commentaries. I think that that's interesting because it speaks to how old the genre is and how old it must have already felt to the people on the tail end of it. Right. So it's it's a little bit related to what I was saying earlier about how in the 1200s, 1300s, people are already kind of converting this into a genre they understand, the prose genre of the saga, out of this narrative poetic style. But I wonder if to the people passing down these poems, let's say in the middle period there, the 1000s, the 1100s, Iceland's been converted to Christianity, people aren't writing this stuff down yet. I wonder if it already feels or seems archaic or old to them. And if that also affects the way that it's passed down to us in the sagas, right? I wonder if there's even like conscious updating. As you read the poems about the Volsungs and then read the Volsunga saga, note places where that updating might have occurred, where it's being sort of freshened up for the 1200s, 1300s. There's definitely places, I guess I'll give you a spoiler of my own opinion about this. There's definitely places where the tone of the saga of the Volsungs feels very Viking age. And then there's places where all of a sudden it feels like I'm at a Rin Fest, right? You know, everybody's sharp dressed, all the armor is glinting, and there's banners, and you know, there's princesses and towers and stuff. And of course, from the 1200s, 1300s perspective, that's hyper modern. And the fact that the descriptions of people in places like that are being updated to that contemporary standard makes me wonder about how many other things are, right? So an interesting example of this to think about, Professor Van Deusen, will y'all be reading any of Saga Prof. Kraki or the Saga of Airborne?
Not this time. I took it out
Okay.
because we're reading the Kalevala and some Sami legends.
That's cool. Okay, well, I'll mention that these as an example. So the these two sagas don't have that much to do with one another, although they're now published together in one volume. Have you seen this yet?
It just arrived in my mailbox at the university. So
Mine too. Mine too. So it's nice looking, isn't it? Anyway, these two sagas are both written down fairly late. The Saga of Kraki later than the Saga of Airborne, and both are based, however, on some very archaic poetry. The heroes of these sagas are, to judge from the references of really old poems, some of the oldest heroes celebrated in Germanic languages. So we have a huge gap, like a 700-year gap in the case of Rolf Kraki between the first mention we have of these characters and the saga being written down. Now, what's interesting is that, and you have a sort of similar gap with Airborne, although it's a little bit tighter. What's interesting is you have these two sagas based on long poetic traditions, somewhat equally old long poetic traditions, getting reworked at sort of similar times, early 1300s to 1400s AD. And you get completely different attitudes toward women, I would say. Right? I would go so far as to say that the saga of Rolf Kraki is pretty misogynistic. Right? I mean, women are abused in untold ways in the saga, and there's just about no positive female character. And you know, every bad thing that a woman character gets, the narrator is sure to remind you that she deserved it because X, Y, and Z. But then you have a total contrast in the saga of Airborne, where you have women filling lots of important roles, including cultural roles that are kind of unusual, right? This is one of the classic shield maiden sagas where we have both a grandmother and her granddaughter who are shield maidens or women warriors. So to me, that's also a reminder that even as these stories are getting reworked, there's different people alive at every stage of history, right? You could have, it's a reminder these cultures aren't monoliths, even if sometimes they can seem that way to us. So we have to remember, this is almost a good closing thought. I should have written this down. We have to remember that in looking back at these poems and the sagas that rework them, we're not only looking at a depth of time, but we're also looking at a culture that's fairly broad and contains a lot of different circulating ideas, including some very powerfully conflicting impulses about really fundamental questions about human roles. Boy, that's almost a good wrap.
That's great. Well, we've got some time for questions.
Of course. Yeah, any more questions, comments, criticisms, complaints, manifestos? I have gotten manifestos occasionally, so now I just
bet you
ask for
have.
them up front. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I get the odd email from somebody I don't know. I can only imagine the amount that you get.
You know that I hired someone.
Yeah, I think Stella, is that right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, you have, because you have my actual email.
I will not circulate that.
Yeah, thank you. No, all of this sounds like weird humble brags, but I have a big project of trying to bring good information about these subjects to people where they're looking for it, which is the internet. And unfortunately, the internet is the internet. So, you know, the conflicts are legion, or just the weirdness is legion. Nicholas asks why I like to use reconstructed Old Norse pronunciation. I learned it with modern Icelandic pronunciation, but I was told it's another way to do it.
I told them that.
So,
you learned Old Norse with
okay.
me. I'm very clear too that I don't think that there's some of these two, you know, and I think we've talked about this as well. It's sort of perceived as like warring factions, but it's simply like personal preference. For me, it's because I speak modern Icelandic and it gets too confusing otherwise.
Sure. No, I love the things that people sometimes think people really, really fight about. It's like there are things we really, really fight about in this field, but I feel like the pronunciation thing, I feel like the majority of people use modern Icelandic. And you know, I'm above judging them for it. I also speak modern Icelandic, and in fact taught modern Icelandic at Berkeley. And I feel like it helps me keep them separate because to me, they are not that similar, right? I mean, yeah, they're more similar than Old Norse and modern Danish, but I actually like keeping them really strictly separate, and the pronunciation helps me do that. Another reason that I do it is a lot of my research in historical linguistics, and so I'm interested in how sounds change over time. And so it's very useful to me to have kind of a sense of what this language would sound like at different points. Now, that also means that I'm aware that when I read, say, Havamal in reconstructed Old Norse pronunciation, I'm reading it in the pronunciation of the time it was written down. I'm not reading it in the pronunciation exactly at the time that if it was composed in like the 900s in Norway. I'm not doing that because that would have yet more differences. But it's mostly just about my background in historical linguistics and wanting to keep these different stages apart and have a legitimate sense for myself, for my own purposes, of what it would sound like that. I also think it's just a little bit easier to teach. Modern Icelandic pronunciation has, you know, more exceptions, and this letter sounds like this in this position and that kind of thing, because it's trying to stay very similar to Old Norse spelling, even though the language has changed quite a bit. So if I'm just teaching you Old Norse, I just think I can teach you the reconstructed Old Norse pronunciation in a day, but it can take me weeks to get you sounding decent in a modern Icelandic pronunciation. And I just feel like the effort is better spent other ways, because when you land in the airport in Reykjavik, everybody's going to speak to you in English anyway.
It's true. I want to go back to Colby's question here. What are your thoughts on people who appropriate Norse mythology to further racist ideals? Because I know that's something you've dealt with, something I've dealt with. Any hate mail that I get from the general public usually has something to do with the fact that I have pushed against those tendencies of certain very loud minority groups.
Yeah, it is a lot of my hate mail too. My hate mail tends to concentrate more on a sort of anti-Semitic side of things, I suppose. There is a widespread, I guess you could say, rumor that I'm Jewish. I'm not, for the record, but but I'm not anti-Semitic either, right? So it's weird that the way this kind of gets phrased as an accusation, like I wouldn't regard it as an accusation to be Jewish, right? You know, typically what I find is these people can tell that I'm not one of them just from the way that I talk about this stuff, right? I don't idealize the Viking past the way that a lot of these groups do. I'm frank about not holding anti-Semitic or racist ideals myself. I also don't dwell on it a lot because I think that if I start, you know, every single video on my YouTube channel by saying, this doesn't belong to Nazis, people who come to it not knowing that Nazis claim a lot of this say, why does he mention Nazis all the time? And I don't want to put that out there either. You know, I have certainly received a lot of threats from these groups. Again, it typically is anti-Semitic in nature. And I have had some encounters that are unpleasant. I will say I am a faster draw than any of these idiots, and that is some small consolation to me, but obviously not to everyone who might be in one of these positions. I don't know exactly why this is such an obsession for many of these groups. You know, in denouncing me or whatever, they just broadcast that my channel, my translations exist, right? Like in the internet age, attention is currency. I actually try not to give them that currency. When they give me that currency, to me, it's sort of a strange, counterproductive thing from their perspective, I would think. But I also don't really know exactly what to do about it directly. I sort of try to address it more indirectly by making it clear that there really isn't any sort of explicit justification for racist or anti-Semitic ideals in these old texts. A lot of what they think justifies it actually comes from crappy public domain 19th and early 20th century translations that they really like. So for example, one of the things these types point to is Ríkisþula, where you have the god Heimdallr sleeping with the different classes of human beings. And a lot of early translations, which are often ones favored by racist groups, have terms for the lower class that make them sound darker. In fact, the terms in question, if you know Old Norse well, refer to the sunburn nature of people who work outside, as opposed to the less sunburned people who have more leisure time. But they still will use it as justification for there being some sort of, you know, racial obsession at the heart of Norse poetry. And there's no racist obsession at the heart of Norse poetry. It's written down in Iceland in the 1200s. People's obsessions are like, did my neighbor steal my sheep? Not people thousands of miles away are lower, and we have to have poetry that supports this. And then, of course, by the way, I'll point out, if you are crawling around the internet looking at people talking about Norse mythology, first of all, God bless you and keep you. But second of all, a lot of times anti-Semitism is couched in anti-Christianism, which is sort of somehow more acceptable, right? So you'll see a lot of and I know this mostly because I get kind of a briefing from my assistant who watches for this stuff on my channel. You get a lot of people who say like Snorri is a Christian writer, but Christian is in 3 parentheses, right? Which is one of the big ways of saying Jewish. So watch for that. A lot of that surface anti-Christian stuff is actually a very virulent anti-Semitism. Anyway, I hope that sort of addresses that. It is a problem we deal with in this field, but it has not made me stop trying to reach the public with good information about this that's not tainted with that agenda. In fact, it's continually renewed my resolve to get good information about this out there that's not tainted with that kind of agenda.
And I think it oftentimes gets mixed up with some of the hypermasculinity stuff as well. And I know that when you had me on to talk about gender and women in Old Norse society, there were some comments that had to be moderated within within that live chat. And it oftentimes it all gets sort of wrapped up together. But I think it's sort of the very hypermasculine ideologies as well.
Sure, and not to drag this on too much longer, but I think sometimes superficially people come into this expecting me to be more sympathetic to that line than I am, because I'm a guy who wears a cowboy hat and shoots competitively and drives a pickup truck and all this, right? But like, that's in a way, that makes me actually less willing to, suppress who I really am, which is that guy, which, is, I guess, more traditionally masculine than not. Because I also kind of want to say, look, you can be whoever you are and leave other people alone to be who they are. You don't have to be this angry pisshead about it. Pardon my French.
That's all right.
Like I can be as masculine or whatever as I feel inclined to be, and that doesn't mean that I'm threatened by someone else, who doesn't want to live up to whatever ideal, right? I don't care. It's your business. But man, some people cannot let it go that other people want to live different. And I guess what I'm saying is sometimes I think they look at me and they say, oh, this is a guy who wants to push the same agenda. It's like, actually, I don't. I want to live my way, and you do what you want.
Absolutely. Just a couple more questions. So Vince asked what your take on God, or your opinion on God of War's take on Norse mythology, and maybe a great closing one will be Liam's question about culturally how you want Norse mythology to be perceived.
Okay. As far as God of War, this actually I did just a couple weeks ago on IGN, the video game channel. I did 3 interviews about this. So I did one about the original God of War game, and then 2 about the trailer for the new one, God of War Ragnarok. I've actually never played God of War. I'm not a video game player, in spite of the fact that I contributed a lot to Assassin's Creed Valhalla. I just, it's not something I do. So I don't have an opinion from, like the gameplay side of things. I will say Assassin's Creed Valhalla has a lot of Easter eggs for people who are real into Old Norse language.
I actually did notice one thing was why were the steeples there like 300 years later in Norway? Like, because the timing was like the 800s, like late 700s, early 700s, and there's like Christian steeples in Norway. That kind of threw me off.
Well, okay, so I'm not an archaeologist. None of that stuff was ever really run by me.
Well, it was never run by you?
It's more, no. Language stuff. Language is what people bring me in for.
Right.
And I'd also point out that with any project, and this is true of anybody, Ubisoft Montreal, they do really care. They really try much harder than any other media company I've ever worked with to get those things right. At the same time, thousands of people are working on a project like that, and not everybody's going to talk to everybody else, and they're not necessarily going to have somebody to check every single little thing. But on the language side of thing, including the names of characters and such like that, I did have a surprising amount of opportunities to influence that. There's actually an interview on my channel, if you search for with Darby McDevitt, who is the narrative director of Assassin's Creed Valhalla. And we actually answered a lot of questions from my Patreon supporters about it. And we talked a lot about some of that process and some of the things that wound up being more or less historically contemporary with the time they were trying to present. Hopefully that's a decent answer. And then you also had asked down here, culturally, how would you want Norse mythology to be perceived? So I suppose you mean something like how, if I say I teach Norse mythology, what do I want people to hear in that? Something like that.
Yeah, like how, like the social connotations to it generally now have these weird fixations because of the associations with white supremacy. So I was wondering.
But not to everybody. So actually what's interesting is I spent the last year and a half working on a collaborative media project that I won't name, where I constantly warned these people about these associations, right? And issued warnings like, you know, don't use that picture. I see it on all the white supremacist websites or something like that. Or, you know, don't phrase this way because this is how all the, you know, the Hitler Humper guys are phrase this, and they're going to recognize their phraseology in this. You know, you can do this in such a way that you don't have anything that looks like an allusion to any of their stuff. But if you're lazy and you don't listen to me, you can make them feel like they're getting shout outs. And they're just like, no, what are you talking about? There can't possibly be this much cultural baggage associated with this stuff out there. So there's people who are completely in the dark about it, right? Or people who I mentioned that I teach this stuff to. And then, you know, like one of the responses I get just drives me crazy. It's like, it must be so nice to teach a subject there's just no controversy about because it's just all the past. Yeah, you know, my head is just blown off of my neck and it's halfway to Jupiter now. So not everybody is aware that those conflicts are there. You know, at the same time, it amazes me how much people, not just of those inclinations, but of many different inclinations, want to see themselves as Vikings. People want to identify as like, I am a Viking, I am a Norseman, I'm a whatever. It's fascinating how much identity gets wrapped up in this because, you know, for example, and people assume that my identity, Professor Van Deusen, I'm sure runs into this too, must be wrapped up in it too. I don't know how many times I've started talking about one of these subjects, even in a classroom or in a public talk, and someone says something like, well, I don't believe in your gods. Okay, I'm not trying to convert you to worshiping the Norse gods. Like just because I studied this, just because I talk about it. One of my best friends is a paleontologist. Nobody thinks he wants to be a dinosaur, right? But there's this weird way that people like project themselves into this and think that you do if you're studying it. And I don't know exactly what it is. And it's not just, like I said, the Hitler Humpers. It's people of a lot of different walks of life. I don't know exactly what it is that just draws people into identifying with it so powerfully, because I don't feel like you see that as much with Greco-Roman myth. I don't meet that many people who want to be centurions or centaurs or something.
As someone who kind of studies a bit of Irish myth, I definitely see it a lot there. I think what it has to do is kind of a consequence of whiteness. If I'm to offer my own to not even a bachelor's degree sense on it, is people want to find and have some kind of cultural heritage, because a lot of that gets specifically in the North America, because a lot of that is kind of erased by whiteness. And so it feels just personally to me that that kind of mythology provides an escape and connection in a social community that they don't really have, and it feels very intrinsic because it's people feel that there's some kind of genealogical or historical connection to that, and I think that's emotionally very fulfilling for them.
I think it's a valid point, and I think actually that ties well into something I see Ioane saying here in the chat, and that I think actually segues well into a nice tying up point, which is so Ioane mentions it's Norse mythology influenced by maybe absorbed elements from Sami cultures as well. I think that a lot of the best stuff, and this just gets a little bit subjective, but a lot of the best stuff that you can find in Norse literature and myth actually has a very universal appeal, right? I have no Scandinavian ancestry myself. This isn't about my ancestry. I don't seek my identity in my genealogy. But I think when you look at something like Havamal, you see a really timeless practical wisdom that's actually a lot like what you can find in the Old Testament in books like Proverbs and Ecclesiastes. It has similarities to what you can see in the Tao or in the Analects. It has similarities to even more ancient works like the instructions of Shuruppak from Sumeria or the instructions of Ptahhotep from ancient Egypt, you know, some of the oldest books in the world. I think that many different cultures converge on a lot of the same practical wisdom. And part of what fascinates me about Havamal is here is this same amazing universal practical wisdom that you see all over the place for thousands of years, and it's popping up in the Viking world, right? When people call Havamal the Viking code of ethics, it's so close to making me laugh, because it's not like at all a Viking code of ethics. There's, yes, you can kind of tell the cultural context it comes from, but it's not as if all this stuff about, you know, not drinking too much would resonate well on a Viking longship, right? It's so to me, a lot of it is that amazing universal practical wisdom. And yeah, as Colby mentions, people are going to assume you have a hidden agenda behind your research. I really try not to. I try to put everything about myself on the surface, you know, and people are going to like that or not. I'm not maybe what anybody would like me to be, but at least I hope people can just see what I am and not try so hard to read that kind of stuff out. Well, Professor Van Deusen, what do you think?
I just wrote samesies, no hidden agenda for me either. I just find this stuff really interesting. I find it to be a very fascinating period of history. Yeah, I do think that like the idea that people get really fixated on, you know, Van Deusen, that's not a Scandinavian name. And so that's the reason that I would study this. But anyway, it is really, it's a whole other thing that I know that we have to deal with. And it was really a pleasure to have you today.
Show me your ancestry.com readout.
Exactly. How Scandinavian are you? Where are your ancestors from?
I get this all the time. By the way, this is one of the most annoying things I get. Is people are like, well, you say you don't have any Scandinavian ancestry, but your name is Scottish, so you probably do. You probably can talk about this legitimately if you go and look at your ancestry.
Yeah, no, like
as if that's the legitimate thing.
Is that, you know, my husband's last name is Bjork, and people are like, well, why didn't you take his last name? You'd seem more legitimate. I'm like, because I didn't want it. Like, I don't think that makes me more legitimate. Anyway, sorry to get a little rant there, but it was really, really great to have you. And we give a round of applause to our speaker. And
thank you, everybody.
I will
thank you for your time.